Great to be with you. Thank you for the time today. I don't know, key 226, somebody here? Okay, not mine. So, pleasure to be with you. I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I want to talk to you about faith and technology, the future of tech, and your role, our role in that. And first, a little bit of my faith journey. I was born in this super rural area in Pennsylvania, and I used to joke it was halfway between Reading, Pennsylvania and Hershey, Pennsylvania. You get to this tiny town called Robizonia, right? So you're at nowhere, and we were 5 more miles. Right, so yeah, you get to know where we were 5 more, and I was baptized when I was 6 days old with full knowledge of what I was doing. Yeah, okay, we're livening it up here. This is good. And there were 2 good reasons to go to church as a kid. One is not to get in trouble with Dad and my uncles. The other was to meet girls and impress their mothers and grandmothers. That's why I went to church. President of the youth group. I thought I was a Christian growing up, and moved to California when I was 16. We'll come back to that in a second. At 18, I moved to California. Went to a Christian church there, and after going there a few months, the sermon was Revelation 3:15 and 16. I know your deeds. You are neither hot nor cold, but lukewarm. But since you're lukewarm, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. And that convicted me that day, and I decided to be hot for Christ that day in February of 1980 as an 18-year-old, and that began my faith journey. But just a couple of months after that moment, I'm in the halls of Intel, and we'll come back to that in a second, and I'm walking down the hall, and I feel called to go into full-time ministry, right? And I'm like, God, I love tech. The first time I touched a computer, it's like, man, I was hooked, right? I could tell that thing what to do, right? And it was a whole 256 bytes of RAM. That was like super cool, and, right? It had like remember those 2 like LCD display, yeah, that was, I was hooked on it. God, I don't want to be a full-time minister, so I spent months arguing with God, right, for it, and finally I laid a fleece before God, and I says, okay, God, if this happens, I will become a full-time minister. And the answer was, the workplace is your ministry. And that began my journey as a workplace minister. So how many of you are Christians? Okay, how many of you are full-time ministers? Okay, let's try. How many of you are full-time ministers? How many of you are, if you are a Christian, you are called to full-time ministry, and a few of you are called to vocational ministry. So the question is, as full-time ministers, how do we exercise our faith in the workplace? How do we demonstrate? Is there enough evidence to convict you that you're a Christian in the workplace? Right? And if not, you're not living out your Christian faith in the workplace, in the home place, in the school place, in the marketplace. And that began my journey of faith and technology. And my life verse became Colossians 3:23 and 24. Work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that you receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. So I became a full-time workplace minister. So that's a bit of my faith journey. But my technology journey, remember I was this young farm boy in Pennsylvania. I accidentally took a scholarship exam when I was 16 years old. I won a scholarship, so I skipped my last year and a half of high school. Was at 18 years old, was graduating with my associate's degree, and this guy from Intel, his name was Ron Smith, he came recruiting in this little associate's program in Lincoln Technical Institute in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and he interviewed 12 people that day, and I was number 12. And any of you who've done interviewing, about 6 or 7, you sort of lose track. Who was who? Right, about number 10, you can't remember male from female. I was number 12. And Ron wrote, he says, smart, aggressive, arrogant. He'll fit right in. And I got invited to come and interview with Intel, and that began my technology journey. And I started at Intel at 18 years old as a technician, and as I like to say, I went through puberty at Intel. I started so young. And the picture here, this is Gordon Moore, Moore's Law. Robert Noyce, the inventor and Nobel Prize winner of the integrated circuit, and Andy Grove. and they were my mentors. And I began a mentoring relationship with Andy Grove when I was young in my career. And mentoring with Andy was like going to the dentist and not getting Novocaine. Yeah, that's how it felt. He was tough, he was hard, he was demanding, he made you better. And I mentored with Andy literally up to the point that he had the coolest job on the planet, right? You just sort of say, okay, this is like fun as a geek. I was engineer number 4 in the 386. Say, hey, John, would you mind standing up? Okay, I have to point this out. John Crawford works, with Global Media Outreach on their board, and John worked with me on the 286, the 386, the 486, the Pentium, and was one of the key architects for the Intel x86 family. So my friend, and I help lead John and Norma to Christ. So, super excited to have John here in the audience, and anything I say that's not quite true, just ask John. He'll straighten it out for us all. But worked in the 386, 486, 14 generations of microprocessors, helped to create USB. How many of you have used USB? Yeah. When my granddaughter plugs a USB stick in, she says, "Thank you, Papa." Oh. Yeah, helped to create Wi-Fi and standardization around Wi-Fi. And I remember, like yesterday, my first congressional testimony for the unlicensed spectrum for Wi-Fi. Right now, you can imagine, as a young engineer, right, going in front of a Senate committee, right? I was like, wow, right? This is like a holy place, you feel, as a young engineer, right? It's a little bit chaotic and so on. And everybody hated me, because you had the national broadcasters who all of Spectrum should be theirs. You had the service providers, right, the AT&Ts, et cetera, all Spectrum should be theirs. And then, of course, you had the entire defense community, all Spectrum should be theirs. And I was arguing free Spectrum, right? So everybody hated me. What a wonderful thing to do as a young engineer. But you might have heard we succeeded in creating Wi-Fi. Did you hear? Yeah, cool, right? So, standards, right, just an incredible journey, right, of creating some of the core technologies, and Core and Xeon. Xeon and the industry standard servers became the basis for cloud computing, as well as standardizing how computing could be done horizontally at scale. I also then had the incredible pleasure to move from Intel to EMC and VMware, and became my first CEO opportunity at VMware to help establish. And when I came back to Intel, it's like, okay, God, why was I the CEO of a software company for 8 years? And then Glue happened, right? And now all of those experience, Glue is a software company for the faith ecosystem at scale. And I always say that God is the great conservationist, right? If you're living in His will, He wastes no experience that He will take you through. You may have no frickin' idea how that's going to be materialized in your life, but He is the great conservationist for every experience, the good and the bad along the way. So 8 years as the CEO of VMware. 4 years ago was called back to Intel to be its CEO. And as part of that, leading the CHIPS effort, creating the CHIPS Act and getting that through Congress. And have you ever tried to get bipartisan legislation through Congress? Yeah, what a learning experience, boy, right? And, it's, politics and, I'll say, having gone through that journey, right? And many of you, independent of Republican or Democrat or whichever, side of the aisle you may take, most of our congressional leaders are good people trying to do the right things. The large majority. Some of them are scumbags, but the large majority of them, good people wanting to do the right things. And here with the President, Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, having the opportunity to be there when we signed into law what I believe is the most critical piece of legislation for industrial policy since World War II, getting the CHIPS Act across the line. Because what aspect of your life, and here speaking to a technology audience, what aspect of your life isn't becoming more digital? Everything is. And what does digital run on? Chips, semiconductors. And we have lost semiconductor manufacturing to Asia. We are critically dependent, 100 kilometers from China shores, and this tiny island that has inadequate power and no natural resources, et cetera. Our entire economy is precariously hovered on a supply chain that is not resilient, that we all painfully saw through COVID. So these are some of the experiences that I've been able to participate, in my faith and technology journey. December 1st, unexpectedly, I began a 100-day journey that I never dreamed of as I abruptly was retired from Intel. One of the most painful situations of my life and my career, because I was all in to finish the journey of revitalizing Intel. And some of you have gone through tough career experiences, as you've gone on your journey of life. That was my toughest one yet. And it began a process of, okay, God, what's next? What is this next phase of my journey? And my wife very quickly said to me, you're not done. And what's next? And we're going to talk more about that. But before we get there, I'd ask you the question, is technology good or bad? Good or bad? What do you think? Great. Okay. Anybody say technology is bad? I will argue technology is neither good nor bad. It's neutral. It can be used good. It can be used bad. Did you say that when you were up here? Yeah. I hope you said it the right way. Okay. And if you think back to the Roman roads, why did Christ come when he came? I'll argue the Pax Romana and the Roman roads. The word could go out. Right? The greatest technology of the day was the Roman road system. It was used so the word could go out. Who was the most important figure of the last 1,000 years of humanity? Okay, think about that a second. I will argue Martin Luther, the most significant figure of the last 1,000 years. And what did he do? He used the greatest piece of technology available at the day, the Gutenberg printing press. Right? He created Bibles, he created language, he invented a third, right, of the entire German language. He broke, right, essentially the monopoly on the Bible translations, that the Vatican and the, evil cabal of the local political leaders with the Pope, et cetera. He ushered in education. He created the systems that led to the Renaissance. Okay, that's a little punk monk who only wanted to get an audience with the Pope because he thought he had a few theological errors. Man, I'll argue most significant figure of the last 1,000 years using technology to improve the lives of every human that he touched at the time. And we see this over and over again, that technology can be used for good, can be used for bad. Energy, nuclear weapons, right, or nuclear reactors, over and over again. We participated in the creation of the mainframe era. Remember the mainframe? We only needed 8, I think it was 7 or 8 of them, Thomas Watson said. That's all we need, right, to do all the computation of the day. Yeah, well, okay, he got that one a little bit wrong, right? And every phase of this has led to more opportunities to use technology to improve the lives of every human on earth. And my mission statement, since I began my faith tech journey, is that I would work on a piece of technology that would improve the lives of every person on earth. How audacious is that? That's pretty audacious. How we doing? Every PC, every cloud, every Wi-Fi, every USB? Okay, I've participated in maybe touching 60 to 70% of humanity at this point. Right? The power of technology that we can reach and deploy. Now, I want to also, confess before you, I helped to create the net neutrality laws. Were those good or bad? Okay, it allowed social networks to emerge. Were social networks good or bad? Right? And there's enormous evidence today that social networks have led to the denigration and the polarization, right? The use of it to reach minors and sexual activities and taking child into deviant behaviors, destroying relational values very early on. So good or bad? Yeah, a lot of bad came from that. And we'll talk a bit more about that before we conclude today. Because I think we have this unique opportunity as a faith tech community, right? And I decided that, we should really think about ourselves, geeks for tech. Okay? No, geeks for faith, right? Geeks for God. What do you like? We have to pick one of these as, our mantra for the day, right? Because we have this unique opportunity to be technologists and to shape it as a force for good. And when we think about AI today, right, this is the big kahuna of the day, the largest one. Now, how many of you remember the first time you used the internet? Okay, do you remember it? Right? I remember it was on a VT100 terminal, right? You remember those, right? And I went into the lab in Jones Farm, Jones Farm 2, and I went on the internet. Oh, it was like a holy moment. And it was a Tuesday, and I had time to get back into the lab on Friday to do it again. If you kept your teenager off the internet for 10 seconds, you have ruined their very lives. Right, you heinous individuals, you. Right, how could you do that? Right, and it's become so pervasive in every aspect of humanity. AI is more important. AI will be more significant. AI will be more dramatic. And as we think about, since the first Dartmouth conference in '56, right? It's gone through the winters of AI, and nothing has emerged. And then, it gets exciting and collapse and exciting and collapse. And then generative AI. Okay. This is now incredibly useful. And we're going to see AI become just like the internet, where every single interaction will be infused with AI capabilities. And, in the 75-year or so history of computing, we humans have been adapting to the computer. When Linda and I, my wife Linda, when we first were dating, she said, "Do you know any other languages?" And I said, "Yeah, I know about a dozen, and I'm working on English." Right? Assembly, Fortran, Lisp, Prep, et cetera, right? And I'm still working on English, right? She wasn't humored, right, by my comment. But we humans have been adapting to computers in the history of computing. With AI, computers adapt to us. We talk to them. They hear us. They see us for the first time. And now they are becoming a user interface that fits with humanity, right? And for this and so many other reasons, that every technology, has been building on the prior technology, AI will unquestionably the biggest of these waves, more impactful even than the internet was. And we're moving through, networks, machine learning, generative AI, reasoning, and inferencing. And today, your brain's about 20 watts, right, of power. And to generate the best large language models today is about half a gigawatt. Isn't that incredible? How bad we are, right? Just how bad AI is today. And they're even cruddy models, right? The best generative AI models today still suck compared to the human brain, right? And we're using hundreds of thousands of times more energy to create those models. Right, on it. We have so far to go yet, but it's so appealing, powerful, and useful in what we're already able to accomplish. And when I was at NVIDIA Developer Conference, I said we only have to get AI inferencing 10,000 times more efficient than it is today, for us to truly deploy and make it available. Only 10,000x improvement. And we're going to do that. We're going to find ways to make it more efficient, more powerful, and capable. And, for that, it will usher in. And, AI, will be incredible and powerful. But I envision what I call the Trinity. And imagine we're here about 15 years from now, and we'll go into the most powerful data center on Earth. Okay, you ready for this? We're going on this virtual journey of tomorrow, and there will be a set of classical computers. There will be a set of AI computers, and there will be a set of quantum computing in that data center, because certain problems are only solvable with quantum effects today. So, one of the companies that's Playground, PsiQuantum, building the first 1,000,000-qubit quantum machine. Right, and I believe that we'll be able to solve computing problems, classical techniques that that John and I worked on for many years, AI techniques that are exploding and being deployed today, but then we're able to solve quantum effects with quantum computing. That'll be like the trinity of computing that we'll see emerge over the next decade or so, when we'll see all of these effects come together. So it's an extraordinary time, but I'd also say, can we truly make AI a force for good. And when DeepSeek came out, that was about 2 months ago. You remember the DeepSeek when it was first released? And I posted a blog about DeepSeek, and I said 3 things we need to learn from the DeepSeek experience. One is engineering is a task of constraints. Right? You never have enough computing. You never have enough resource. Engineering is always getting good stuff done with the available resources. And DeepSeek proved that they could get a lot of good stuff done with the available resources. They cut out software layers. They did, innovations inside of the stack. They just, spanked us because they did good engineering. Second thing, people said, oh, this is a collapse. We aren't going to buy any more AI chips. NVIDIA stock went down 20% that day. I bought stock that day. That, of course, was before the Trump tariffs. I thought I was smart. Maybe not anymore. But it was the gas law or Jevons law, that cheaper computing begets more need for computing, right? And the cheaper that we make it, the more that we need, the more useful it becomes. So obeying the gas law. But the third, and I think the most important, was open. And it was the most open model, and I think this was the third area, that the US and the cloud guys were spanked. We need open. How we think about AI models, what data is it trained on, what are the model weights, how's the inferencing done, is so critical because we're embedding knowledge, embedding values, embedding understanding into those underlying models, large language models, and every aspect that happens. It must be open. And this is part of, what I think is critical about us being together here, today, that we need to be creating trusted, open, useful AI that we can build humanity on. And as I already said, we didn't show up for social networking, right? And when you look at the algorithms of social networking, it's, connecting a potential buyer up to a potential advertiser, right? And mediated by some algorithm in the middle. In comparison to AI, it's trivial what a search or social media network is doing. And it denigrated society. What we do with large language models is far more important because truly we are choosing how we embody knowledge of all time into those underlying models. And they need to be open. They need to be trusted. And for that, we think that we have to, really drive that technology, and we'll call it, flourishing AI standards. And, this is a big piece of what we're doing at Glue, a big piece of what we're seeing done with, work at Harvard and Baylor. Can we actually have frameworks that say we're creating technology that truly leads to the flourishing of humanity? And that's what we would say. Can we go drive these types of standards, these understandings, into the underlying models? Now, human flourishing, it's a pretty vague term, right? Well, Aristotle spoke about human flourishing. So we only go back, 2,500 years, right? It became a formally recognized portion of psychology, this idea of human flourishing about 40 years ago. So in this, and what you'll see released at the end of this month is, the most comprehensive set of data and understanding about human flourishing that's ever been done, being led by Harvard, Baylor, and others, to create these frameworks. Because if we're going to show up to influence AI broadly, we have to show up with good engineering, good data, good understandings, good frameworks. How do you measure things like, is that leading to better character? Is that leading to better relationships? Is that creating better vocational outcomes? Is that a valid view of a spiritual perspective? We need good underlying data associated with each one of these. And for that, we're actively involved. We're driving to create that underlying data set because we need to show up with good data if we're going to influence how AI is created. We need to do that through every aspect of what we do. And if we think about, each of these dimensions, right, and you can slice them different ways and think about them differently, but a tremendous amount of work, and you'll see this being published at the end of this month, papers in Nature, right, that are going to be speaking about this, some of the most seminally well-recognized institutions saying this is good data that truly says do these technologies lead to human flourishing? And when we think about that, do you care about, your family relationships? Do you care about your vocation? Do you care about financial, wellness? Think about and walk around this wheel. And clearly one of these is spirituality. And all the studies of what is most important to humans, spirituality ends up in the top 3 for 60 to 70% of every human on the planet. So of course spirituality is on the list, because faith is one of the top priorities for 60 to 70% of humanity. The top 3. Am I healthy? Is my family well? My faith perspective. So of course it needs to be represented. But of course then we need to have good data around what it means to say human flourishing associated with it. And against that, the work that we're doing with Glue then is to say, we're going to build open environments. Those environments are going to be trusted. We're going to have proper licensing of content around those environments, that we can build proper trust, that we can, be, showing up into these communities. Some of the things that I've worked on in my career, I've helped to create so many computer benchmarks. We always joked it was sort of lies, and benchmarks. That was a joke, okay? Right? But how do you go measure things in, true, good, data-driven ways? Well, for the AI systems, we need to create good benchmarks. Hey, if I ask about God, does it give me a good answer or not? If I ask about, relationships of my children, does it give me good answers? And we need to create the corpus of data to give good answers to those questions. And armed with that good data, we need to show up to influence the total landscape of AI. We want to benchmark OpenAI. We're going to benchmark Gemini. We're going to benchmark Claude. We're going to benchmark Copilot. We're going to, use that to say, okay, on human flourishing, how'd you do? Right? We know that your first token latency was this. We know that you were able to do this many simultaneous conversations. But how did you do on the most important thing as you gave me questions? Right? And of course, did you pass the math exam? Did you pass the LSAT exam? But did you give good answers for the most important thing of human flourishing? And we have to create the standards and then show up to influence those communities, be public about them, be measuring all of the models. And every time they come out, run the benchmarks again. How are we doing? And create this environment that says, yes, these models are open. They're trusted. We're also going to be driving the licensing of that. Did you violate my copyright when you trained your model? Did you violate my copyright when you inferenced on that model? Right? Create good licensing. The foundations of so much of our industry and our community is the licensing of our information. And we're going to drive those flourishing standards across the industry. And next up, Alex is going to be speaking on some of these topics coming, right after me. But, delivering services that we use broadly, as part of what we do as a community. Creating data services, rights management, APIs that we're driving. So this is what we're going to do at Glue. But we want to be part of a broader community in that discussion so that we're influential in creating flourishing AI. Technology as a force for good. AI that truly embeds the values that we care about, that we want to honor, that we want to be representing into the future and benchmarking across all of them. And, of course, you're going to say, well, I have a different opinion. I'm from the Baptist. Or, maybe you're over here, well, I'm a Methodist. I have a different opinion on some of these things. Or, I represent the Catholic community, so we're a little bit different as well. And, we're sort of a Jewish persuasion, so we're a little bit different as well. And I would just say to that, the Ben Franklin quote, if we don't hang together, we will surely hang apart. This is something that we need to come together as a community if we're going to be influential to show up. And clearly we at Glue are going to be driving this aggressively, but we need to show up collectively if we're going to be influential in driving these conversations, at the national level, right? In the benchmarks, right? Into the advertisers, this, the flow of funds that go into these technology companies. Some of this will get decided with regulatory bodies on a global basis. we have to show up, the faith community, to be influencing those outcomes. Because remember what happened in the social media? We didn't show up. And look at what we got. So are we going to miss this opportunity for something that's far more important than social networking with AI, where it truly in the models embeds every aspect of human history and values into it? We have to show up, team. You know, this is what we have to do in this period to influence technology as a force for good. You know, as a young engineer at Intel, I sat in one of the Intel buildings, and I knew what time Robert Noyce left the building. So as a young engineer, I'd hop up out of my chair, knowing what time it was. I'd go to the edge, and there goes Bob's head, and I would just be always walking out the door next to Bob Noyce. Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. So it was a little bit corny as a young engineer, but to be with Bob Noyce, the inventor, right, this brilliant scientist, right, who led to the beginning of the transistor and integrated circuit. Okay, that's a cool guy to hang out with, right? He was sort of crufty and, not a person of faith, but man, I just wanted to be with him. And this is one of his famous quotes: "Go out and do something wonderful." And when we think about geeks, we have the opportunity to do wonderful things. Truly the technologies that we create get to influence and touch every human on the planet. How many professions get to say, I'm going to touch every human on the planet? That's what we in the technology industry get to do, truly work on things that improve the lives of every human on the planet. And clearly, as we looked at this progression of technologies, that we've seen over history, we've seen that, the power of these technologies is extraordinary. And we get to be in the driver's seat of how those technologies get created, how they get deployed, how they get operated into the industry. Yesterday I had the pleasure of, speaking at George Fox University, one of the Christian universities up in Oregon. We saw my son on Monday. I golfed on Monday, and it was a perfect Oregon golfing day in April. We only had 3 downpours. Yeah, it was just great. But I spoke at George Fox and was there last night, and we had about 800 or so in the audience, most of them the students at the university, and I asked them all, how many of you cheated today using AI? Right? And, a few of them were, noble enough to raise their hands, and then I asked the rest of them, why haven't you cheated yet? Because this thing called AI, right? It would be like asking an engineer, right? Okay, we need you to stop using a calculator, right? You, a finance person, stop using a spreadsheet. Of course, you're going to use the latest, greatest, most powerful tool available, and that's what we need to do in the faith community: use the latest, greatest, most powerful tool available, and grabbing it like Martin Luther grabbed the printing press to change every aspect of human existence of his day. So I would challenge you to, like Robert Noyce said, go out and do something wonderful. That's the opportunity that we who are geeks for faith have in front of us. December 1st was a very difficult day for me. And, being retired from Intel unexpected, I was super clear to, every aspect of what we were, doing at the time that, this was a 5-year journey, and short-termism, Wall Street, were, putting pressure on the board. And so, I didn't finish what I wanted to get done. Part of the things we're working on at, Playground now, things like next-generation light sources and lithography and so on, part of my excitement for those is finishing what I started. But at the same time, as you go through those terrible periods in your career and your life, you're then saying, okay, what is next, God? Right? What is this next piece of the journey, that you're on? And I'll just say, how many of you have had successes in your career? Okay? How many of you grew when you were successful? Liar, liar. Right? You don't grow when you're successful. I was good, wasn't I? Right? If anything, success is an anti-growth because you don't realize where you made mistakes, right? You're too caught up in the good. But when you fail, when you go through challenging times, changing times, that's when your character is shaped. That's when you grow. And, going through this period of time, the last 100 days has been brutal. I wasn't done. I was committed to the journey. This is what I wanted to get done. And then saying, okay, God, what is next? Linda would ask me, is it a Monday or is it a Tuesday? Because I said Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I'm pissed off, angry, and bitter with the board. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday, God is in control, and he has a plan. Okay, you've been there, right? You've gone through those. Yeah. So she would get up and she would say, Pat, is it a Monday or is it a Tuesday? Is it pissed off, bitter, and angry? Or is it God is sovereign and in control? And, here we are, we're having more Tuesdays than Mondays. And, this wasn't the way that I was planning on my Intel journey to end. I didn't feel I was done. But somehow God has a different plan, a different journey. And I just went through an extraordinary learning experience, if I can embrace it and grow through that experience. And in it, it was clear, Linda said even before I did, I'm not finished. And now, my role with Glue as exec chair and heading technology, we are going to change the landscape of the faith community and its role in shaping this most critical technology, AI, for faith and flourishing. That's what we're going to do at Glue, and we need all of your help and partnership to do so, because if we don't hang together, we're not going to influence the outcome. Right? And with my role at Playground, being able to drive the future of quantum computing, material science, bioengineering, semiconductors, and lithography, I don't think I'm done. But at the same time, as you go through a brutal experience, you and I both need to come to the same position like Isaiah did. Here am I, Lord. Send me. Send me. Send us, that we can be shaping technology as a force for good, that we could grab this moment in time. This is the greatest time to live in human history. We're going to solve diseases, right? We're going to improve lives. We're going to educate every person in poverty. We are going to, solve climate issues. We are going to be using these technologies to improve the lives of every human on the planet. We are going to shape technology as a force for good. Here am I, Lord. Send me.